You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 4, Arson, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 23. A Princess Appears.
When training a dragon, it is critical to employ sufficient fireproofing. Dragons are unaffected by fire and have no capacity to understand the danger it poses to other creatures.
Looking for the positive side of things, nobody was paying any attention to Kuro anymore. It was, after all, difficult to worry about something so insignificant as him when something so incomprehensibly significant was happening so nearby. It wasn't actually that nearby, but perspective is a funny thing when a thing as large as Merepogo was in view. The brain simply refused to accept that she was so big, and thus assumed she was actually much closer, so she could be merely terrifyingly large instead of brain-meltingly, vertigo-inducingly, physics textbook rewritingly huge. The massive dragon circled her way slowly, almost ritualistically, up the butte. Her bellow rumbled over the island, filling the collected humans with a feeling that they'd rather hurl themselves into the roiling ice flow-filled surf of the bay than stay on the same island as that monster. But any movement risked drawing her attention, so nobody moved or hardly breathed. All Kuro could think was that the boat had better make record time, because she was climbing to the tallest peak and letting out a bellow of calling. If any large, ferocious, and stupid males were in earshot, they would be on their way to compete for a chance to mate. It seemed prudent to be elsewhere when that happened. An eternity ticked by, metered out by massive clawed feet, each as big as a house, slamming into the stone as she climbed. Winds and rain tore into the crowd, and they just stared. A tornado wandered by and barely drew a glance. There is no collective noun for a startle. No word to capture hundreds of people, in unison, gasping while half their body is turned to face the threat, with hands raised to defend from it, while the other half is turned to run, and then both getting stuck in indecision and freezing up. The whole of Avalon Academy stood in tableau for a moment, like a dance troupe whose choreography had suddenly run out. The pilot of the Princess might have had that kind of observation were she not trying very hard to avoid crashing into the pier. Had the ferry been traveling at normal speeds, she might have also noticed the 3 women who had not been startled, and the 4th who was startled, but only at the fact that she hadn't been. The pilot was, however, entirely focused on not dying and not killing anyone else in the effort. The Princess was not a fast boat. It was designed to transport students safely through the dangerous world of the Blandlands, where nobody could walk on or breathe water in the case of an aquatic emergency. It puttered along at safe speeds through the bay, a fortress against waves and ice. Given the somewhat urgent need to retrieve several hundred children from an island full of dragons, a collection of wizards had retrofitted the boat in something of a hurry. They'd turned the prow into a long, pointed beak to mercilessly slice through ice and water alike, and loaded the stern with enough engines to make an oil tanker skip like a stone. The crew in the command deck looked half dead from the experience, and yet more alive than they'd ever been. They shared a breath of relief that the journey was over, and that their blade-like prow hadn't sliced anyone in half as it embedded itself in the retaining wall at the end of the dock. The gangways were lowered, and boarding began at a remarkably measured pace. One might expect a mad panic of people flooding onto the ferry, but through a combination of bewilderment, terror, and the firm voice of Ms. McCutcheon, muscle memory took over, and they queued while waiting for their names to be checked. The boat was going to make a much slower return trip, loaded from lower hold to top deck with every student, staff, and faculty member aboard, but that would be fine. There was no rush to get anywhere once past the Veil. The Blandlands did not, so far as anyone aboard knew, have a dragon problem. A call went up that they were one body short. One short is a terrible number to be. A dozen missing children and every competent wizard would be in the air in seconds. One missing staff member, and people have to make very unpleasant decisions as to whether to wait, to search, or to assume the missing person is already in the belly of a dragon and leave, but forever live in doubt. The name rolled through the crowd. Merlin Clark. Merle, the janitor, whom hardly anyone knew and fewer thought about. He lived alone in the school. He'd been missed in the wake-up calls. He might not even know anything was happening. Kuro went to find him. He didn't tell anyone. He just snuck off the far side of the boat and flew off before anyone noticed him missing. He couldn't explain himself, not fast enough anyway, and not well enough to be believed. He was the best to go. Mere Pogo wouldn't hurt him, and they didn't need to wait for him. He could get to the far side of the bay himself. Probably. Maybe not on the first try, but he'd get there. Probably. And he could bring Merle in his bag. It was the best plan in a hurry. Once far enough from the boat that he might not be noticed, he caught the wind and shot up the butte. He'd apologize for the intrusion, maybe give his dragon one last pie, and if he was really lucky, rescue Merle from his bedroom at the top of the school's clock tower. He crested the edge of the plateau at the same time as his dragon. They both saw Merle. He was standing in the center of the huge circular garden that he tended dutifully, filled with roses and rimmed in gold. Kuro watched Merle fail to run. He just stared up at the dragon, but not in the sort of terror appropriate for encountering a creature with the proportions of an ocean wave. He looked at her with adoration. Mere Pogo paused in brief confusion at the tiny man standing in her path, and then prepared to incinerate him and the rose garden together. That moment of hesitation was enough for the wizard to act. With a wave of his hand, the huge gold ring that circled the garden launched out of the ground. Not just a decorative rim enchanted to keep the weeds out, but a huge ring utterly encrusted with runes. It hooped over the dragon's snout and cinched itself tight around her neck. The bright, fierce intelligence faded from her eye, and she settled in front of Merle. Kuro flew down to his dragon. Instinct overtaking him, he tried to pull the magical collar off her. It was a wholly pointless effort. It was thoroughly enchanted and enormous. He'd have better luck trying to overturn a freight train. "Let her go!" screamed Kuro. "She's not a monster! You don't understand!" "I understand very well, my boy," said Merle, "and so would you if you'd stop to think for a moment." The voice was the same, but the tone had shifted. He sounded certain, confident, callous. Kuro turned to look at the man he'd been sharing tarts and chess matches with. The janitor reached up and pulled off the wig he wore to disguise the circlet cinched tight around his bald head, one that filled his mind with thoughts and memories. "Roche." "Of course," said Merle. He caressed the huge scales of the stilled dragon affectionately as he spoke, like the first touch of a long-absent lover. "Slower than I'd hoped, but you got there." Their activities drew the interest of some of the children. A glance from Merle and Mere Pogo stirred. A snort from her and the hatchlings scattered away, though they stayed close to their mother. They were afraid of something, and it wasn't Merle. Their heads raised, looking for something they heard in the distance. Kuro heard it too. No, not quite heard. More like he knew he was hearing it, but his ears hadn't reacted to the sound waves. Like he was listening to a sound coming from something just to the left of the reality he occupied. What he thought it would sound like if he had heard it was the screaming roar of adult male dragons. He followed the hatchling's gazes, and he saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the edge of the veil and the tumultuous bay beyond. But also, as if seeing double, there was no veil at all, and beyond the lack of veil was a whole flight of dragons, screaming at each other and fighting as they flew to answer Merepogo's mating call. "You should probably go," said Merle. He said it in the proud, matter-of-fact tone of someone who had just laid down an unbeatable hand of cards. He had won. He controlled the board and all the pieces. Letting Kuro go wasn't even a mercy. It just wasn't worth the effort. The game had already been decided. Kuro fought to make sense of the wrestling perceptions of the world. Above the lands beyond the bay, across miles of treacherous waters, a dragon had caught sight of the boat, which was only a few hundred yards away from it. It broke from the screaming flock to investigate. The wizards aboard couldn't see it. Behind them was nothing but the shimmering sheet that separated worlds and the stormy winter waters beyond. They didn't know to leave. They were probably still fighting about whether to look for Merle, or worse, trying to find him. Kuro took a last look at his dragon, her wise old eyes blank and distant. He swallowed his desire to fight an already lost battle, and ran. He hurled himself off the butte without even pulling out his umbrella. There was plenty of time during the fall to sort that out. The wind roared, pulling him down and out across the spring forest at eye-watering, ear-popping speeds. The roar of the dragons and the illusion of them beyond the veil faded. By the time he was sliding belly first to a stop across the deck of the Princess, he wondered if he'd imagined it. He was convinced otherwise by the arrival of a quite large dragon. A full-grown adult male dragon compared to Merepogo is like a cat compared to a human, substantially smaller but considerably more vicious. To a cricket, the difference between the two was somewhat academic. Being crushed casually underfoot or bit in half both had the same end effect. The dragon landed hard on the deck, its talons tearing into the thick steel. It looked at the boat it had just claimed with greedy eyes, eager to tear open the can and feast on the sardines pressed inside. It noted Kuro and pinned him to the deck with a paw while it decided the best angle to swallow the boy whole. Kuro should have been terrified, but he was too angry. Angry at losing his home in Autumn Lodge, angry at losing his school, angry at losing his dragon, angry at being tricked and lied to, and most of all, angry at himself for not being able to do anything to stop it. The dragon was not going to take anything else away from him, at least not for the very short amount of time he still drew breath. This boat and everyone and everything on it did not belong to that dragon. It belonged to Kuro. It was his. What happened next would become a matter of debate and theorizing among wizardly academic types for decades to come. Kuro, the boat, the people on board, and a not insignificant quantity of water vanished from the dock. The void swallowed them all, stretching them out into whisper-thin threads of nothing so they could slip easily between the complex geometries of the universe. The void, having something of a sensitive digestive system that reacted poorly to large foreign objects passing through it, expelled them in less than a hiccup in a place Kuro's subconscious had decided was safe. Safe from dragons, anyway. Safe for fairies is a different matter. The princess splashed down, and then quickly ran out of water that had come along for the ride, and crashed the rest of the way down onto the driveway outside Bytown Royal Orphanage. It, and all the people pressed inside, groaned as it tipped on its keel and came to rest at a precarious angle. Passengers lurched and stumbled off the boat. Most fell to their knees and gripped the ground upon reaching it, taking comfort in the solid and reliably three-dimensional nature of it. There was unanimous consensus that wizards did not enjoy being teleported. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.